bring all this together. Got to talk about Christian conservatives and neo-conservatives today, and really those are the two most influential forces in Republican politics from the point of view of ideas today. Okay, we really already discussed contemporary conservatism as a general topic, because as we've talked about, contemporary conservatism comes out of classical liberalism, and in a lot of ways is very similar to old-time classical liberalism, in that it desires limited government, it's suspicious of raising taxes, it believes in the power of private property, that the more property the person has, the more they can do with it, the better off they'll be and other people will be. Contemporary generic conservatism leans towards libertarianism, especially when it comes to property and taxation and the influence of government, regulation of government on people's lives and so forth. Okay, so the generic, as I'm going to put it, sort of contemporary conservatism, is interested in downsizing government, devolving power back to the local level as much as possible, cutting taxes, and generally in favor of traditional values, okay, over liberal innovations or the liberal idea of progress in moral matters, okay. But there are two offshoots from, maybe we should turn off the, we don't need it. There's two offshoots of modern conservatism, as I said, which have become more influential over time. And the first one I want to deal with is Christian conservatism, okay? There's a history and a background, and we can't go into it in great detail, but suffice it to say that for quite a long time, fundamentalist Christians were not political activists. That, as a matter of fact, such people tended to sort of shy away from political involvement with the idea that political involvement was a worldly pursuit, and their focus was on otherworldly things, on and on things central to their own family and their community. And so they saw politics as a sort of diversion that would maybe lead them away from their central interests and values. Many of the fundamentalist Christians of the past were from the South and were Democrats, and didn't see for quite a long time any disconnect between their religion and their membership in the Democratic Party. Membership in the Democratic Party was de rigueur for a long time in the South because of the aftermath of the Civil War. Okay, but now, especially in the South, in the late 70s and into the 80s, we started to see a shift politically. Okay, with previous Southern Democrats becoming Republicans. And there were a variety of reasons for this. Some people say that, most of those folks should have been Republicans all along, but they had this sort of gut-level allegiance to the Democratic Party that for a long time held sway, but as they began to see, the chaos of the civil rights movement, demand for affirmative action, things like that they disagreed with, integration that disrupted their communities, moral changes in the family, changes in social policy that they disagreed with. These people started to become more active and to switch parties, and so you get this big shift in the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It's a shift in the party, not in the mentality of the people. It's just at a certain point, people finally broke loose from what they'd been doing for so long, which didn't make a whole lot of sense really, and shifted their allegiance to the Republican Party. And these people, because they felt pushed by liberalism in a lot of ways, felt that they had a duty and a responsibility to become politically active. So we start to see them organizing at this time. Okay? Now, to sort of back up, this has been the result of a growing discontent about our overall culture, and this discontent, not just in the South, but in the North and the whole country, among people who were more inclined to religious traditionalism. Okay? So I've mentioned the particular Southern issues of integration, affirmative action, and so forth. But in general, the growing moral liberalization of the family, the breakdown of the family, okay, there was a lot of talk about that, the growing number of divorces, of children born out of wedlock, poverty caused by single parenthood, and so forth. These people also saw a growing disrespect for life as abortion became more and more common, so abortion became a major issue for them. An attack on their religious freedom by strict separationists. The other side of the coin of Christian conservatism is groups like People for the American Way and the ACLU and so forth that are very, insistent upon strict separation between church and state and even between religion and politics. And Christian conservatives see this and saw it and see it as a hostility towards their traditional beliefs and ways of life. Also, they complained about the liberal indoctrination and hostility towards religion in our schools. Okay, that previously in public schools for quite a long time, it wasn't uncommon for people to, have a prayer at the beginning of the day or to be able to talk about religious themes in school, and suddenly they began to see a hostility towards this type of religious expression. So there was a call for prayer to be put back into the schools, and that's where that comes from, and for religious expression to be welcomed there. Also, in the 70s in particular, there was a lot, and we've noticed this in our class discussion, there were a lot of liberal themes going on in the entertainment media. A lot of the sitcoms and other shows on TV were trying to push social liberalism, and between that and the perceived liberalism of the news media, they began to feel as though their way of life, their particular belief, which they previously thought of as mainstream, sort of like the majority of Americans see things this way, started to feel more like a minority, and sort of a besieged minority with the overall culture sort of going against them. Okay, so that's where you get this term culture war, which is actually a term that I have heard used by both Christian conservatives and neo-conservatives who share some of the same concerns about the overall culture kind of arguing against traditional values and ways of life. So, in particular, though, for the Christian conservatives, it was the idea that the Christian culture, which they believed was the dominant culture of this country, was under assault by the elites of the education establishment, the media, the entertainment industry, the intellectuals, the legal beagles constantly suing, and so forth. And because of all of that, as well as the Southern shift, okay, towards the more, I guess, agreeable party, Christian conservatives, actually started to speak of themselves in those terms, okay, and to become more ideological and more politically active. Right? So one way of sort of very succinctly, summarizing the culture war as the Christian conservatives see it would be the people represented by the Christian coalition versus the people represented by People for the American Way. Okay? If you're not familiar with these organizations, one way to get a feel for the difference and how they view each other is just to look at the websites of these two groups and how they deal with each other, with their general frame of mind. The Christian coalition would see People for the American Way as the enemy, the people bent on breaking down traditional values and destroying traditional institutions, okay, through any means they can. And the People for the American Way would see the Christian coalition folks as sort of backwards, not wanting progress, being prejudiced, all of those kinds of things. And sometimes the conflict, the culture war, gets pretty ugly because of the way that the parties see each other and speak about each other. But anyway, Christian conservatives felt they had a moral responsibility before to stay out of politics, but now they had a moral responsibility to get involved in politics. And so for the first time, you get people becoming active in their churches politically. Okay? Black people had been doing this for quite a bit longer. The civil rights movement, in a lot of cases, centered in its organization around churches. But white people hadn't done this before, okay? And so this was a new development. And we had on top of the local activism of people in their churches, these nationwide ministers or evangelists and groups that sort of led the charge and defined Christian conservatism. You have Ralph Reed, who was the executive director of the Christian Coalition for a time, and tried to sort of update and make the Christian conservative strategy more sophisticated. Pat Robertson, he is the founder of the Christian Broadcasting Network, the Christian Coalition too. Jerry Falwell, Dr. James Dobson focus on the family, and I'm sure you can think of other groups. But in all of these cases, these were the people who sort of became like Rush Limbaugh is for sort of a mainstream conservative. They became for the Christian conservative, somebody that you could look to for your analysis, your direction, the program, the plan of attack, and so forth. And these groups developed programming on TV and radio, on political and social issues. They encouraged church activism. Okay, one of the things that Pat Robertson's famous for is developing the voter guide strategy, where you put together the list of comparing people on issues or legislation if they've been in office before, and rating them on the basis of the group's priorities. Okay? And then basically mailing them out and handing them out to church members, who then know who to support if they want their vote to reflect their priorities. They urged Christians to become political activists. Okay? And primarily this involves what we might call charismatic and fundamentalist Christians, but it spread out beyond that to some Catholics, some mainstream Protestants, and so forth. And one of the more interesting things about the Christian conservative movement is that it took, in some cases, the strategy of liberal activists from the 60s. Sit-ins, boycotts, protests at abortion clinics, placard holding, visible action of protest, and use that pretty effectively in order to be seen and heard and become a topic. Now, oftentimes it was a topic of, sort of negativism of, what are these people doing, disrupting abortion clinics and so forth. But they were getting their name out there, they were getting their ideas out there, what they represented out there. Okay? The Christian Coalition and Christian conservative movement found a home in the Reagan administration. And by what I mean by that is that Ronald Reagan listened to them. He made them feel welcome. He listened to their leaders and used their leaders as advisors, among others. And so for the first time in a presidency, they were welcome to speak their mind. On the other hand, I've also said Ronald Reagan was not a Christian conservative. He was a Christian and he was a conservative, but he wasn't a Christian conservative of the type that I'm describing. He was a sort of mainstream conservative, but he reached out to the Christian conservatives, and he could see that a lot of their values could be incorporated in the mainstream Republican Party. Okay? He didn't have any problem with the pro-life stance, and that was a platform in the Republican Party, and still is. He was not uncomfortable with them, and he knew that they represented a very strong grassroots movement. They have never been the majority of, say, Republicans, but they have been more willing than most to actually get out there, walk, deliver literature, protest, and do other things. In other words, shoe leather activities, grassroots activities, and that's hard to ignore. And Reagan and other politicians of that era knew that you couldn't ignore that. These were people that, could really help promote the Republicans. They could also just help promote conservatism. And if you didn't have them on your side, they could also be a pretty negative force against what you were doing too. Okay, so Ronald Reagan accommodated them, and the Reagan administration, 2 terms, accommodated them but never fully reflected, okay, their agenda. I think that's fair to say. I mean, all of this is a little subjective, but accommodated, incorporated to a certain extent, but never fully reflected their agenda. And I think it's probably fair to say that no Republican president has fully reflected their agenda, including George Bush, okay, the current George Bush. On the other hand, they incorporate parts of that agenda, and they are respectful to the Christian conservative movement and understand that it represents a pretty strong part of the Republican base, okay, very active. So they are probably the most notable, most visible, bottom-up force in the Republican Party, okay? Let me stop there and ask if you have any questions or comments about the Christian conservatives. Well, he didn't fully reflect their agenda. By that I mean he was pro-life. He didn't make the pro-life position one of the central pillars of his plan. He is much more about lowering taxes, limiting government, stopping regulation, and so forth. So part of it's a matter of emphasis. His emphasis was not on restoring morality, okay? It was about restoring pride in America and respecting moral values, and he did talk about the family, but his emphasis more was on, you know, let's grow the economy, let's stop limiting people's economic activity, let's stop regulating them, let's give people the freedom, you know, that they need to grow. He was not big at all on arguing against, say, separationism. Yes, he was capable of talking about it, and did, but this was not high on his agenda to rail against, you know, strict separationists and people like that. So I'm not saying that he totally abandoned any of these principles, but it's a matter of emphasis, and I don't think he fully reflected. He wasn't going to fully reflect the Christian conservative agenda in all of its aspects. Prayer in the school, he sort of talked about that a little bit, but didn't do anything to. Actually, ironically, in a way, Bill Clinton did something that Ronald Reagan could have done. He basically issued an edict to the public schools of the country saying, no, you can't outlaw prayer in the schools. You know, you can't stop a kid from praying. And here's what people have the freedom to do, and here's what they don't. Because by then, I think everybody was aware that there was a lot of misconceptions about what you couldn't do in public schools, and sometimes atrocities were happening, like some teacher coming over and stopping Johnny from, you know, praying at the lunch counter or drawing a cross, and that does happen sometimes. And so, you know, Clinton did something about it. Okay? But during Reagan's administration, it wasn't yet such a huge issue. Okay. All right, so the Christian conservatives are that grassroots movement, as I say, and if they're the grassroots, then the neocons are sort of what I might call the grass seed pods, okay? The Christian conservatives are a lot of ordinary folks that are organized, okay, in order to try to influence Republican politics and influence the political and social policy of the country. The neocons are not the grassroots, they're sort of the I don't know, more like the ideas people from the top, and if they're going to have influence, it's sort of from the top down. Neocons are not a large group of people, statistically speaking. They're pretty small. The people who would call themselves neocons and really know what they're talking about are relatively few. Okay? There's a lot of people who generally agree with them. Okay? But as far as those who identify themselves as neoconservatives, a small group of people, but very influential group of people. Okay? Now let me just tell you a little bit about neocons. How many of you outside of this class have ever heard of neoconservatives? Okay, about half or so. Okay? And would you say that you know very much about them? Okay. You know about them, okay. Because I've talked to you about them. You know everything I know. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, a lot of people don't know very much about them, okay? And yet they're extremely influential, and I would argue, I think with very good reason, they're more influential in the Republican Party than Christian conservatives, okay? They're not as visible, and people don't understand where they're coming from as well, all right? Now, Who are they? Well, neoconservatives tend to be sort of ex-Democrats that got burned by too much liberalism. Okay? So most of the leaders of the neoconservative movement are actually ex-liberals. In some cases, ex-socialists. All right? Who, because of their experiences, have rejected their previous ideological position. A couple of very important experiences that led to this change or this conversion in these people. First of all, supporting communism or socialism, okay, but then seeing in the 1940s and 50s, or actually the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that communism was oppressive and dictatorial and wasn't really about making common people's lives better off. And so in one case, Irving Kristol, I believe is the one, who was a Trotskyite, and he was an out-and-out socialist. But over time, he saw that it just wasn't going to work. Socialism didn't work. It actually oppressed people. And with that realization, he began to change his mind about the, all things liberal, okay, and broke with the Democratic Party. Also, the events of the 60s, and I believe Robert Boyd Bork points this out. He comes from this perspective. What they saw there was, in the 60s, was a movement that was too much about what they would see as decadence, moral decadence, the drug culture, moral relativism, all of the different moral experiments that the 60s people tried. Also, it was represented too much rigidity about how to fix problems. Neocons could see that a lot of the solutions that seemed to make sense about fixing poverty in the 60s weren't working. In the 70s and 80s, they could see that these programs had been tried for a long time, but actually they seemed to almost create more poverty and more dependency. And the neocons said, we can't be so wedded to this particular way of dealing with poverty that we ignore the fact that poverty still exists. So that was another way in which they shifted. They tended to be turned off by the self-centeredness of the 60s and 70s, that it was all about me and my self-discovery and my feelings about myself and so forth. They were the type of 60s liberals who actually wanted to change the world for the better, and it turned them off to see so many of their fellow 60s liberals so focused upon themselves and not really doing much, in their view, to fix the world. Also, they reacted to the pacifism of the 60s. Okay? That, in their view, pacifism sounded nice and would be nice if we could do it, but it doesn't work and we leave ourselves vulnerable. And of course, the experience of World War II weighed heavily on their minds there too, that, when you appease somebody like Adolf Hitler, what happens is he just rolls right over you. And so this was a lesson that they thought liberals had not learned, and so they just rejected the pacifism. Okay. I had let's see if I still have it. Had something I was going to bring in. Yeah, here it is. I found something on the web from the Christian Science Monitor entitled Neocon 101, and among other things, it has a description of some of the neocons' background and beliefs. And it says here, and this is true, the original neocons were a small group of mostly Jewish liberal intellectuals who, in the 1960s and 70s, grew disenchanted with what they saw as the American left's social excesses and reluctance to spend adequately on defense. Okay? Many of these neocons worked in the 70s for Democratic Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a staunch anti-communist. By the 1980s, most neocons had become Republicans, finding in President Ronald Reagan an avenue for their aggressive approach in confronting the Soviet Union with bold rhetoric and steep hikes in military spending. After the Soviet Union's fall, the neocons decried what they saw as American complacency. In the 90s, they warned of the dangers of reducing both America's defense spending and its role in the world. Okay? That's the other side of the Reagan administration, the side that you didn't really know about. the Christian conservative agenda wasn't the only one that the Reagan administration was listening to. It was also listening to this, and you saw that in the Reagan administration's foreign policy. Okay? Maybe not as much as the neocons would like, okay? But America's foreign policy during that time was much more aggressive, much more proactive. Okay? There was much more spending on the military, and of course the eventual collapse of communism in the Soviet Union was partly attributed to that spending and the aggressiveness of defense. All right, so the neoconservatives were all over that, approved of that, inspired it. One person from the Reagan administration, Jean Kirkpatrick, would be an example. She was the ambassador to the UN. She is a neoconservative. But there are many others. Now let me just give you some names. And these are mainly Jewish intellectuals. And there's a lot of reasons why this grows out of the Jewish intellectual movement, but among them is the experience of the Holocaust and the experience of World War II and the lessons that they felt that they learned from dealing with that type of aggression. Anyway, Norman Podhoretz is an example of a neocon, and he is the editor of Commentary, which is one of the most influential political journals of today's conservatism. He was the guy who was a diagonal socialist, but changed his mind. Okay? Irving Kristol. Let me just write a couple of these down. Norman Podhoretz, by the way, has written a 54-page article in Commentary last month on the history of the United States and terrorism and the current foreign policy of the Bush administration. And it's very much explains the Bush administration's foreign policy in this area. Irving Kristol, who's now very old, he's a member of the American Enterprise Institute. He's called often the godfather of Neo-Conservatism, founder and editor of Commentary. Also, he was influential in developing the journal The National Interest. Probably some of you have heard of these, and also The Public Interest. The National Interest tends to focus more on international relations. Okay. Bill Kristol, Irving Kristol's son, whom you see a lot on TV commenting, and he is the editor of the Weekly Standard, very important magazine right now for conservatives. These are the publications that are providing the intellectual basis for contemporary conservatism today. Okay. Commentary, the National Interest, Public Interest, and the Weekly Standard.
Would you see Neo-Conservatism as being like the intellectual, kind of the brains of the Conservative Party? Would that be something you could say, or is that an exaggeration?
Oh, it's somewhat of a, well, not much of an exaggeration right now. It hasn't always been equally in every administration. It was fairly influential in Reagan's administration, less so, say, in Bush Sr.'s administration, but then very influential in George W.'s administration. So I would say right now, for sure, it's more or less the brains, the ideological argument for the conservative positions. Whereas the Christian conservative movement it has the principles that it defends, but its influence is really its activism. Now these folks are activists in a way, that they're out there always talking about their ideas, publishing them, trying to gain influence in the administration, and many of the members of the administration dealing with foreign policy in particular are neoconservatives. But they haven't done any sort of mass movement or grassroots movement, okay? And that's a very different approach, okay? Their approach is to try to provide ideas that people can latch on to, whether they be President Bush or people like us, too, and their ideas tend to trickle down into a lot of areas. Rush Limbaugh, who a lot of conservatives listen to, in a lot of ways reflects neocon ideas that are in the air, that are everywhere, And so they get out to everybody else and help people to understand, and if they are so inclined, accepting the policies of the Bush administration. Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, basically reflect the neoconservative perspective. Richard Pearl, who was chairman of the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Board until 2003. So I'm just putting these names out there so you may recognize some of them. Elliot Abrams, Senior Director of the National Security Council on Asia and Special Assistant to the President. And Robert Kagan, who writes for the Atlantic Monthly, also for the Weekly Standard and the New Republic, which is also another place where you can find the New Republic and the National Interest. Robert Kagan is somebody that if you read much on foreign policy, you're going to run into one of his many books or articles. Okay, George Will is an example of a neocon. Condoleezza Rice. Okay, and I could go on and on and on. All right, you get the point. Okay. All right. Now, what makes the difference really between these two is partly a matter of emphasis again, okay? These two are not opposed to each other, and so, they can coexist side by side in influencing contemporary conservatism. They don't tend to be the same type of person, so there's a sort of cultural divide, you might say, between them, okay? Which is perhaps unfortunate for the Republicans. But they are not as interested, even as the Christian conservatives, in limited government. Remember, most of the intellectual leaders of this movement are ex-liberals. And they didn't reject liberalism because they wanted to have low taxes, okay? They rejected liberalism because they thought that the liberal solutions were going wrong, okay? So they don't really necessarily have as big of a problem with government spending as even Christian conservatives, who kind of tend to think that, agree with the, generic conservative that, maybe we ought to get government as much out of our lives as possible, because usually it's trying to promote something that's not good for us. Okay? What they want is for programs to work, and so they're often very critical of programs and public education because they see it as not working. I mean, we should spend money on it, but we've got to do something in their view to make it actually effective. Also, neoconservatism isn't coming from the religious perspective, and that's a major difference as far as just their perspective. The neocons at the top tend to be Jewish intellectuals, but they don't even really, outside of being very pro-Israel, they don't really even bring the Jewish theology into their analysis. Okay, they're fairly secular in their approach to the topic. On the other hand, neocons do understand the importance of preserving traditional values, and so they do agree with the Christian conservatives about separationism, about trying to stop what they view as sort of ultra-liberal attack upon traditional values and religion. All right? Somebody like Robert Bork, who wrote Slouching Toward Cumorah a couple years ago, is all over cultural relativism and moral relativism and doesn't like that stuff at all. And many of them call for what they call cultural literacy. They believe that the American public education system has not educated people about their own culture, their own history, and tends to try to make people anti-American in its approach. So you see the difference there? I mean, they're not coming to the issues through the religious lens, and yet they do, in a way, end up in the same place. Okay? Not wanting to agree with what they see as an assault on traditional values. Neoconservatives' emphasis is not on abortion or heterosexual marriage or other issues, but they basically agree on these issues. Okay? So again, their emphasis, and I think Reagan kind of displayed this tendency. Their emphasis is not on, the pro-life movement, or in this today's world, the anti-gay marriage issue. but yet they agree that abortion is wrong, they're pro-life, and that marriage should be between a man and a woman, and they're perfectly capable of, standing up and saying those things and even defending them, but that's not the love of their existence, okay? That's not what they're all over, and that makes them a little different. Their first love is definitely foreign policy, okay? And again, I'll read this to you because I can't find any better way to put it than this. It says here, neocons believe that the United States should not be ashamed to use its unrivaled power to promote its values around the world. Some even speak of the need to cultivate a U.S. empire. Neoconservatives believe modern threats facing the U.S. can no longer be reliably contained and therefore must be prevented, sometimes through preemptive military action. Most neocons believe that the U.S. has allowed dangers to gather by not spending enough on defense and not confronting threats aggressively enough. One such threat, they contend, was Saddam Hussein and his pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. Since the 1991 Gulf War, neocons relentlessly advocated Mr. Hussein's ouster. Most neocons share unwavering support for Israel, which they see as crucial to U.S. military sufficiency in the volatile region. They also see Israel as a key outpost of democracy in a region ruled by despots. Believing that authoritarianism and theocracy have allowed anti-Americanism to flourish in the Middle East, neocons advocate the democratic transformation of the region, starting with Iraq. They also believe that the U.S. is unnecessarily hampered by multilateral institutions like the UN, which they do not trust to effectively neutralize threats to global security. Okay? Does that sound familiar? It really should, okay? Whether you agree or disagree with this, it's very important that you understand where it comes from and that you can actually go and find out where it comes from. If you want to know where it comes from, you can start reading these, okay? It's really as simple as that. Okay, so very pro-Israel, very much about aggressiveness, a good defense is a good offense, all right? Unilateral and coalition building, but not multilateral. Very big distrust for the UN. A growing belief, as I've seen in some of these articles, that the UN is a very corrupt place, that it's really not about peace and world security. It's about people making money and, disrupting each other's plans, okay? They do believe that when the Middle East changes to become democratic, then there won't be any safe harbor for terrorists. Okay? So that's their theme in foreign policy. On education, on domestic issues, I should say, they are for education reform. So that's one area where you see them coming out. Not only are they friendly to ideas like maybe trying voucher plans for competition among schools, but also they promote changes in the curriculum to return to older, more classic standards of what an education is. Okay? So there's a growing number of groups that are trying to influence, how we teach in grade schools and junior highs and high schools.
This is going to be a really ignorant question, but what is the issue? I keep hearing about vouchers. What is that issue? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's the idea that the government will give you a amount of money in the form of a voucher, which you can use. This is just one of the many schemes, but that you can use to either support a public school or a private school of your choice. Okay. So, and the idea there is if people don't like their public schools, or they don't like one of their public schools, okay, that they can vote with their feet and their money and reward the ones that are doing well, and that competition will make all the schools better. Okay? Now, part of the objection, when there are objections to this, is that of separationism. What about, can we have taxpayers' money going to a private or parochial school that promotes a religion? So that's one problem that's raised. Also, it's just the fear that that some schools will just be destroyed by this, and that some people who are served by those schools won't be able to go someplace else, and they'll just the school education, what little there is, will be ruined. Okay. But the neocons react to the education system as though it is really a disaster. That it's putting out
It's just doing a lot of disservice to a lot of people. They are concerned about inner city situations, and they have worked on ideas to try to fix those. But, they're very critical. Let's just put it that way. And part of their theme is we've got to get students back to what they were learning, say, in the 1940s and 50s. One example that I've run across, because I'm trying to fill it. This is an area where I do agree a little bit with the neocons because I'm an educator. I'm trying to fill in the gap of my son's education. One of the things that they used to teach is ancient history at this age, like in 2nd and 3rd grade. They don't at all. They hardly teach any history at all. But they used to teach, Rome, ancient Rome, and ancient Greece, and the Persians, and all that stuff. And kids love that too. So I'm reading him all this stuff, because I think that is important. If you don't get it then, you're probably never going to get it. We have changed the way we educate kids a lot. And so they're trying to fight against that. They're about anti-discrimination because of who they are. So they're all over anti-Semitism, racism, anti-Christian discrimination as well. Any form of discrimination. The neocons are not for any form of discrimination. All right. Let me just stop there and ask you if you have any questions about either of these two. With homosexuality, they're not too liberal there on homosexuality. You're right. What somebody like Bill Kristol might argue is that they don't want to outlaw homosexuality, and they would be against any law that say these old sodomy laws and so forth. On the other hand, they're definitely against homosexual marriage. And what they argue is that marriage is an institution that grows out of religious institutions, and therefore if you allow it to be redefined, you actually discriminate against everybody else for whom marriage means one thing in particular, marriage between a man and woman sanctioned by God. Neocons are a little less likely, I think, to argue against legal union, okay? Christian conservatives are more likely to argue against legal union because they believe it's the sort of the first step down the path, okay? But I haven't noticed neocons getting as exercised about that. But you're right. I mean, they don't want to extend that word marriage to anything more than what it has traditionally meant. Oh, yeah, neocons are not as big on the tax cut issue as George Bush is, or as a lot of other Republicans are. And I think the Bush administration knows that that's still very important. Now, neocons agree with the general philosophy that you shouldn't overtax people and discourage economic activity. Okay, but they're not as anti-government. They're not, the theme isn't if we let government grow at all, it'll get out of control. Okay? And they do advocate quite a bit of, as you say, spending on the military, but also they wouldn't mind quite a bit more spending on education, for instance, as long as it was spent for some good purpose. So I think there's, this is where the Republican administrations maybe have a little bit of a different emphasis than the neocons. Right, yeah, to the extent that they talk about those issues, it's in terms of reform, making sure that it actually works in the future. Like with welfare reform, they generally agreed with the idea of there being a sort of cutoff period and a work requirement and so forth, and those things have, in their view, worked pretty well. With Social Security, they would be at least friendly and open to the idea of some sort of privatization of the system of Social Security, but they wouldn't agree with cutting it off or saying, now, from now on, everybody's going to have to fend for themselves, and if you're out of luck if you don't, no. Did I see a hand over here? Okay. All right. So I realized that we could spend a lot more time on this, and I'm sure that in a way, because of how many things we've talked about, it's a little confusing. However, I'm also sure that you've probably heard some things that you didn't know. Okay? And that's good. That's what we're supposed to be doing, is educate you about the things that you don't know. And I'm sure also that there's people in the room saying, gosh, I got to pick up the Weekly Standard so I can, this sounds great. And there's also people going, oh my God, these people are crazy. So, but that doesn't matter, The important thing is to know where these folks are coming from. And I think that both of these will be a force to reckon with in the Republican Party for a long time. Christian conservatives have become more sophisticated over time, and they're going to continue to. And at a certain point, their concerns may meld pretty much completely. Who knows? But they're learning how to promote their ideas in ways that are broader and reach out to more people with different perspectives too. And that's a growing process that all movements go through. They start out pretty much, within the group, the self-defined group, and then in their search to be more and more influential, they reach out and they extend. And the Christian conservatives and neocons have both done that in different ways, trying to get their agenda out there. Okay.